As the war in the East against the Soviet Union continued on, there was a steadily increasing flow of volunteers to help in the so-called crusade against communism from both occupied and neutral nations. The most famous among these is Hitler's Nordic volunteers from Scandinavia. Almost immediately after the Germans set foot in Norway in 1940, they began a recruitment campaign, and whilst it wasn't overly successful at first, eventually it began to bear fruit. By the time Operation Barbarossa commenced, there was hundreds of them on their way to help the cause. Most prominent among them was the SS Viking Division, the largest SS division at the time. Although not entirely manned by Scandinavians, the Northmen were an instrumental part of it. The Viking were placed in Army Group South, and they were instrumental in taking Lvov and then continuing on to push through Ukraine. By year's end, they had helped take Rostov, but they were unable to hold on, and so they retreated to dig in for the bitter winter to come, in hopes of delivering the final blow in the following year. Before we begin, firstly, this is part of a larger series on the SS Viking, and partly on the Scandinavian volunteers more generally. You can easily watch this if you're interested in the 1942 period of the Eastern Front, and what the Scandinavians got up to then. But if you'd like to start from the start, then the playlist is in the description, or on my channel homepage. And lastly, a big thank you to my patrons who make these videos possible. Without them, this channel doesn't exist, and I wouldn't be able to go full time on YouTube like I am going to in a few weeks' time. If you'd also like to join our Discord, our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, or if you'd just like to support the channel, then please do consider signing up to my Patreon or my Subscribe Star in the link in the description. Even the $2 tier helps more than you can imagine. Thank you. As 1942 rolled around, the German attempt to capture Moscow had failed right at the gates. The coldest Russian winter for years had sent thousands of frost-bitten Germans back in a bitter retreat, where they were given no time to bury their frozen comrades. This was as true in the south with the Viking as it was in the north at Moscow. The SS men had been unable to hold their toehold over the river too slow, and had to make a controlled retreat back across the river. Here, in the freezing cold, the men waited in their bunkers for the next opportunity to get at the Soviets when the weather was more agreeable. Time was not on the German side, however, as now the USA was in the war, and speed meant everything. If a slow and steady approach was taken, the Soviets could simply bide their time whilst the American Lend-Lease flooded in, and there would be no stopping them. With this in mind, a massive summer offensive was drawn up, with the hopes of crushing the communist superstate there and then in 1942. The Scandinavians would play a key role at both ends of the front for the coming offensive. In the north, you had the 1,218-man strong Den Norsk Legion, who were heading up to Leningrad to join the siege. Meanwhile, a little further south, 1,164 Danes of the Danish Free Corps headed to the Demyansk pocket to be tested for the first time. Further south still, you had the SS Viking, who were taking in their new recruits from the training depots, and they were ready for their starring role in the year's action. Despite some hiccups in the recruitment department, such as an incident where 9 young Danish volunteers were given nowhere near enough training and then sent to the front, where all of them died within days, things somehow managed to stay on track, and recruits, although not that many, continued to flow in. The division was also upgraded, ready for the new offensive, and they were supplied with 3 entire companies of Panzer III tanks to assist them. Hitler's new plan was to conquer the Caucasus oil fields in the south, by far the Soviets' most important source. The offensive was given the codename Fall Blau, aka Case Blue, and in Führer Directive No. 21, Hitler said, "The winter battle in Russia is drawing to its close. The enemy has suffered very heavy losses in men and materiel. In his anxiety to exploit what seemed like initial successes, he has spent, during this winter, the bulk of his reserves earmarked for later operations. The aim is to destroy what manpower the Soviets have left for resistance and to deprive them, as far as possible, of their vital military-economic potential." End quote. And so, on June the 28th, Case Blue commenced with an attack on Voronezh, hundreds of miles north of Rostov. 2 days later, Paulus's 6th Army headed off on their infamous thrust towards Stalingrad. The Soviets assumed the offensive would be in the center, and they began to trade space for time. But suddenly, on the 13th of July, the main event began, and the German army pushed south on the Rostov front. The Soviets were caught completely off guard, and the formations in the south were left at the mercy of the Germans, with no reinforcements. The German artillery absolutely pounded the Soviet lines, and then it was the Vikings' time to strike. They pushed through a gap in the Soviet line, along with the Slovak Fast Division. On the 23rd, they entered the city once more, whilst the Vikings' new Panzer Battalion overran the Rostov airfield. Several days was then spent in brutal hand-to-hand fighting in the city, but ultimately the Germans and their foreign volunteers were victorious. The Viking continued on and pushed forwards with very little resistance. The problem was, however, that Hitler's secondary objective wasn't being fulfilled. Despite the gains being made on the map, the Soviets had given up Stalin's ridiculous hold and fight strategy and adopted the classic Russian strategy of trading space for time so as to lure the invaders deeper and deeper into the interior before hitting them when their supply lines were overextended. This strategy had worked against Napoleon over 100 years earlier, and it was to work once again. The German infantry would often push south 30 or 40 miles a day, and only then would they encounter light probing attacks, and whenever any real fighting did emerge, the Soviets simply disengaged and disappeared further into the abyss. Not even cities were fought over. City after city fell, and the mostly Muslim locals welcomed their German invaders, just happy to be freed from the atheist Soviet regime. All these population centres meant nothing, however, if the Soviets were not encircled and crushed, and if the oil was not captured. By late September, it appeared as if Case Blue simply wasn't working. Hitler, hundreds of miles away, demanded more and more of his men, and demanded that Grozny be taken. Loyal as ever to the Führer, the Viking headed off to assist. The first objective was Hill 711, overlooking the village of Maglebek outside Grozny. The Russians poured down fire on the helpless SS men below, and attack after attack led to nothing, leaving dozens of Scandinavians and Germans alike dead below. For now, the hill held. Then it was the turn of the Finns, who after extremely heavy fighting managed to dislodge the Soviets and sent them tumbling back down the other side. The Soviets immediately counterattacked, but were absolutely obliterated by concentrated Finnish machine gun fire, and in the end, the Finns won the day. This was not without consequence, however, and the hill was renamed Killing Hill by the exhausted Finns. They ended up with 88 killed, as well as 346 wounded. The battalion now only really existed in name only. By early November, the advance continued, and the Germans reached Nelchik, where they were greeted enthusiastically by the locals. This was as far as they would go, however. There was only a few tanks still operational, very little warm clothing, the men's boots were worn out, and the cold was creeping in. Ornulf Bjornstad, a Norwegian volunteer, describes life near Grozny at the time. When I settled down for the night in my foxhole, which was on a hillock, it was raining hard. The temperature dropped, and the water trapped in the foxhole iced over while I slept. When I awoke, it was iron hard, and I was literally frozen to one wall. I couldn't move at all, and my left side was totally paralysed." End quote. Another volunteer, Paul Heviger, from Denmark, said, quote, "I'd served in all the fighting in 1941 and 1942, right up to the Caucasus, and never been wounded, but then I contracted jaundice and was sent home. That was the end of my service with the Nordland." End quote. The end of the line had truly been reached, and the men were freezing to death with very few supplies. The supply lines simply could not keep up with the advance, and there was no time left. Up north, Stalingrad had been surrounded, and it seemed as if everything was falling apart. On the 11th of December, the order was given, and the men began to pull back. Case Blue had been a failure, and the Soviets would keep their precious oil. Whilst all this had been going on, the Den Norsk Legion, aka the DNL, had been spending their time in the filthy trenches outside Leningrad. Bjorn Ostring recalls life up north, quote, "With temperatures below -30 degrees, it was terrible. The positions that we inherited from the attack units were established in a rush just after the cold weather started, and after the army were ordered out of the conquered parts of the city. An order from Hitler said that we would not take responsibility for the civilians of the city throughout the winter. The bunkers were virtually snow caves, since the ground was frozen solid and impossible to dig into. One of my units had it so low under the ceiling of their bunker that our biggest soldier could not turn around at night as his hip was too wide. The soot from our improvised cod oil lamps made us look like Africans, but with white skin around the eyes, where the back of our hand, sometimes, would wipe the moisture away." End quote. Soviet attack after Soviet attack came at the trenches, but the DNL, alongside the Germans as well as many Latvians, repulsed every single one of them, often taking no losses while inflicting massive casualties on the enemy. For the most part though, life was boring. The trench life was almost no different to conditions in the First World War. Each infantry section lived in a bunker deep underground, usually with a stove in the middle of the room to keep everybody from freezing to death. Family photos were hung on the walls, and in the Norwegians' case, usually a picture of Quisling too. The men would take turns to keep watch, and this was the monotonous life they lived for months on end in the bitter Russian cold. Eventually, the Russians began to desert in heavier and heavier numbers, and this let the Norwegians know that there was a major offensive to come. The deserters knew that if they stayed and fought, they would be shot by the commissars if they retreated, so it was best to get out of there now while they could. Hundreds crossed over to the Latvian, German, and Norwegian lines. Finally, this massive assault came as expected, and it was known as the Battle of Urisk. Thousands of fresh Russian recruits charged over the top in World War I style, and they were met by the incredibly well-prepared Norwegians. Hundreds of Russians lay dead all over the trenches and barbed wire at the hands of Norwegian machine gun fire and grenades. As the attack was starting to falter, the retreat began, and to the Norwegians' horror, they watched as the Soviet commissars mowed down their own men by the dozen with no remorse. 50 Norwegians had held out, and only 3 had died, while facing over 1,000 Soviets, in one of the most amazing victories of the war so far. Quisling himself then came to visit his men after their famous victory, and personally awarded them their medals. There was no time to waste, however, and the men were back in action almost immediately. A plan to conquer Leningrad was hatched, but before it could be pulled off, events elsewhere, such as in Stalingrad, brought Leningrad down the priority list. Attack after attack came once again from the Soviets, and the Norwegians were taking heavy losses, despite dishing out many more upon the enemy. By early 1943, the DNL's initial 2-year contract had run its course, and the men were made to return home to Norway to decide what to do next. One last parade was held through Oslo, and then, for most of them, that was it, and they went back to civilian life, feeling as if they had done their part. Bjorn Ostring, the most famous among them, was one of these men, and he stayed in Norway as head of Quisling's 150-man strong bodyguard. The Norwegians weren't the only ones fighting up north in 1942, however. The Danes were brought into action also. At Demyansk, 5 German infantry divisions and an SS division were now completely cut off behind Soviet lines, and the fate of 95,000 vitally important men was hanging in the balance. After 73 days of brutal combat, where the Luftwaffe had to fly the much-needed supplies in to the frozen holdouts, a land corridor was finally created. The Danish Free Corps were then thrown into the pocket itself to fight alongside the beleaguered defenders. Almost immediately, they were thrown into incredibly heavy fighting, and disaster struck, as 2 of the Free Corps leaders were killed, including the famous Count Christian von Schallberg. The day was lost, and when all was said and done, 21 Danes were dead and 58 wounded. On the 10th of June, it was time to roll the dice again, and the Danes played a heavy role in attempting to take the town of Dubrovci. They stormed into the town after wading through swamps and flooded meadows. After brutal house-to-house combat, they were repelled, and 2 more Free Corps commanders were killed. By the end of the day, the town remained in Russian hands, and another 25 Danes were killed. Back home in Denmark, however, von Schallberg was given a hero's send-off, and a huge military funeral was held. To the Danish National Socialists, he was a martyr, and as a result, a new wave of Danish volunteers poured in, seeking to follow in von Schallberg's footsteps. The Danes were then given a chance to make their hero proud a month after his death, when their position was suddenly being bombarded by heavy artillery, and then the full might of the Red Army seemed to pour at them in an endless wave. They lost contact with the Germans to their right, and were very near being overrun. Everyone who could hold a weapon, including cooks and clerks, immediately rushed forward to hold back the attackers. Stuka dive bombers came to their aid, but nothing seemed to be enough, as wave after wave poured forwards. Lieutenant Colonel Kreising told headquarters that they were most likely not going to be able to hold the position, but that they would never abandon it, and that they would fight till the end. They did exactly this, as an entire Red Army battalion came at them, with tank support, and hours of hand-to-hand fighting with knives, grenades, and entrenching tools broke out in the trenches against the massively numerically superior Soviets. More and more Soviet reinforcements continued to pour in, but they were no match for the fanatical Danes, and then suddenly, just after midnight, the Russians began to flee for their lives, and the day was won despite heavy casualties. The next day, another assault came, but once again the Danes and the Germans that had come to support them repelled the endless Soviet charges. By early August, however, only 150 of the original Free Corps remained in the lines, and 300 of them had been killed since they entered the pocket. It was decided to withdraw the Danish Free Corps for a rest and a refit. Their gigantic sacrifice did not go unnoticed, however, and General Graf Walter von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt wrote to them, quote, "Since the 8th of May, the Denmark Legion has been positioned in the fortress. True to your oath and mindful of the heroic death of your first commander, SS Sturmbannführer Christian von Schallberg, you, the officers, and the men of the Legion have always shown the greatest bravery and readiness to make sacrifices, as well as exhibiting exemplary toughness and endurance. Your comrades of the army and Waffen-SS are proud to be able to fight shoulder to shoulder with you in the truest armed brotherhood. I thank you for your loyalty and bravery." End quote. After some leave back in Denmark, the Danes were put back in the lines, but after a few more months, it was decided that the Legion had had its day, much like the DNL, and the formation was disbanded. After a final parade in Copenhagen, many then went back to civilian life, and others went into different units. And so, 1942 came to a close, with the Scandinavians being at the forefront, both in the north at Leningrad and Damyansk, and in the south in the Caucasus. The legions had reached the end of their usefulness, and after they were disbanded, the ones that did want to continue the fight ended up with their Finnish cousins in the north, or south with the Viking. This core group of men would be the ones who ended up seeing things through until the very end of the war. For now, however, things were not looking good for Germany, as the American aid poured into the Soviet Union, and the Red Army became more and more mechanized, more and more well-fed, and gained greater and greater superiority as time passed. The German war machine simply could not compete with the combined might of Soviet industry and American Lend-Lease. 24,446 tanks were produced in the Soviet Union during 1942, 8 times more than the Germans had invaded the nation with in the first place. In reply, the Germans could make only 6,180 panzers of their own. From here on out, it would be an uphill battle for the Germans and their volunteers. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, then please leave a like, as it helps immensely in the algorithm. Next time, we'll see how Hitler's Northern volunteers got on in 1943 with the fresh challenges that awaited them now that the odds were not in their favour. A huge thank you to my patrons before I go. I'll be full-time on YouTube soon, and without them, I would not be able to take such a step. So if you do want to support the channel, then please consider signing up to my Patreon or my subscribe star in the link in the description. Thank you. Thank you to Lobster2U, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsok, Anton Berglund, Levi E, Friendly Brian, Mr. Malabar, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, Henry Unruh, Evan Brightfield, Chef Jeff, Ethan Winstanley, Wunderwaffe, Mr. Bloom, Gav D, Gaius Longanese Hanno, JD, Green Rebel, Angus Roxburgh, Rucksacker Too Heavy, Alexios Podcast Watcher, Citadel and Haste, as well as Inflection Point from Subscribe Star.